Right, so I'm Nick Duty. So much of what I'm going to talk about are the outputs from the FAIRplus project, which is basically involves verification of data sets. So this is a collaboration between FPA partners, so that's pharmaceutical companies and academics. And the target was to verify 20 data sets from these partners over the course of like 2 years, and 2.5 with this extension that we've had. And we're pretty much on target right now. So FAIRplus, the main problem FAIRplus is looking at is that data is not reusable at scale. And there's kind of strategic goals that we have and products that relate to that and these kind of main issues. So usually you can't find any practical advice on how to do verification. So it's a kind of a difficult issue to get that information to people. So one of the outputs that we've developed, which is still in progress, is called the FAIR Cookbook, which collects together practical guidance on how to do verification. So that's the FAIR Cookbook, and I'll point you to that shortly. Another issue is, how to judge how fair you actually are. And there's been various groups working on this, and one of the major outputs from this was the RDA group on fair maturity. And they came up with a bunch of indicators, which is metrics on how to judge the fairness of your data set. The problem with this was that it's very hard, it's very ambiguous. It wasn't, and a lot of the indicators they came up with were kind of compound. They combined together a lot of different things into one indicator, which made it very subjective to use for assessing a data set. So I'm going to talk about those first 2 points mostly. Another output from the FAIRplus project is the FAIR maturity model, capability maturity model. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but that's actually helped us a lot in developing indicators, and that's work in progress at the moment. And another issue that you get with FAIR is a lot of organizations just don't really care or know enough about FAIR to actually do anything about it. So you need to come up with, show people the benefits of that and facilitate changes in data management and culture. So a lot of the work in FAIRplus is the actual practical work is done by squads. And squads are basically cross-cutting teams drawn from the pool of all FAIRplus. So they cover people with different expertise, domain knowledge, and skill sets. And we use those to pull together an appropriate team to work or swarm around a particular task at hand. Normally we have 1 or 2 squads, but we always have the ability to spin up another squad if it's needed. So this is basically how the squads work, or how our verification process works. And this is kind of the presentation level view. I'll show you a deeper dive view shortly. But the first goal is to define the verification goal itself. So we have an onboarding process which involves work package 1, which acts as like a triage to judge the suitability of a project and data set for verification. So that works through interviews and surveys and looks at whether the data is around like a priority area, where there's any ethical issues, legal issues on accessing the data, and what kind of data we'd actually get. We then have a project examination phase, which engages squads. So squads come in here with work package 1 and do a deep dive into the project to see what processes are already existing, where we could do improvements. And then it moves into like an iterative verification cycle. We call this a release cycle, and that's typically about 3 months. So one of the first things we do there is an assessment. So we have a FAIR assessment at the start and then also at the end of the project to kind of quantify what improvement we've made. And that's obviously relative within a project, because you can't take the verification score from one project and compare it to another project. So this is only used internally. And I want to kind of emphasize that FAIR assessments are not a way to judge how good a project is across projects, only internally, relatively within one project. So within this iterative cycle, we have an assessment phase and then a design phase where we look at all the possible things, all the intervention points that we could kind of act upon to improve the fairness of that data set. And then once we have this kind of list of possible tasks, we then, in collaboration with with the kind of project owner or the data owner, we'll discuss which ones are worth doing, which ones will address that verification goal, which ones are kind of going to fit within a 3-month period, whether we have the expertise to do that. And we'll come up with a ranked list, and we'll iterate through this cycle and do as many as we can in 3 months, and then judge our kind of benefit at the end. And of course, then we have like work packages 4 and 5, which do the dissemination. So the key thing here is defining your verification goal, because when you talk about verification, it has to have a context. You can never have anything that's 100% fair. So what you have is like you identify the task that gives you the biggest return, and that's the first thing to do. And then you can go down the list of other tasks. But once you've achieved that first task and improved the fairness, that is for the task that you had in mind. So you can't then probably take that more fair data and then use it with a different kind of context. So you need to think really carefully about what your verification goal is. That is what you want to achieve and how you're going to achieve it afterwards. So this is like the deep dive view. I'm not really going to go into all the details here, but it's just this is an example. So here we have a couple of verification goals, and this is the deep dive, the project examination phase, where we look at existing processes and data and discuss with the owner what the current state is and what we could get it to. And you know, that's obviously like sometimes it's a sparse list, sometimes it's very extensive. Then we come up with design decisions, which mostly focus. These are the kind of key areas that we found in our experience that you can address quite straightforwardly. Usually around identifiers, persistent, global, unique identifiers, and metadata strategies. And those can be metadata at like a general DCAT level or more community-based. Ontologies are usually kind of significant and easy win kind of tasks that we've identified within all the different projects. And then data sharing, which is around licenses and hosting. The key things I wanted to point out here is these two at the bottom. So these are the concrete tasks that were done for the implementation phase. So the green box here indicates a new recipe for that cookbook that I mentioned. And the amber box here is a task that used an existing recipe, but with feedback, you can go back and then refine the cookbook recipe that you have. One other thing to point out is that although we work with individual projects and identify particular tasks to improve the fairness of that data, we try and come up with recipes that are more generally applicable than just for that project. So we don't really want point solutions. We want broadly applicable recipes that can be used in other projects. So on the right-hand side here, you can see we also keep track of the FAIR score before and after. We also keep track of the various indicators that I mentioned that we expect to improve in their individual scores with the implementation phase. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but there's a link to the projects that we've dealt with and their FAIR scores, so you can have a look at that link afterwards. I should also point out that there's a few slides skipped there which have a more detailed example with some notes, but obviously with a 15-minute slot or 10-minute slot, there's not time to go into it. So I'll quickly show you what the cookbook looks like. So if you go to the cookbook, you'll see you get kind of an overview of the recipe. It'll tell you how long it's going to take you to read, what the content is, how hard it is, what kind of skill set you need. And that's true of all the recipes. They all have that section. There's different ways to browse it. You can browse it by the kind of FAIR axes: findability, accessibility, interoperability, reusability. And we're working on ways to improve the searchability of that. So here again, this is what's on the left here is what's present with all the recipes that you look at in the cookbook. So it'll have what you'd expect from a cookbook: the ingredients, which is like the tools and skills you need to use it, a step-by-step guide, which might have some kind of code examples and details, and references on what related recipes and where you can get more information. As I said, I've not got time to talk extensively about the cookbook itself, but there is a link here to the webinar that's quite recent. So this was a good kind of metaphor that came up in one of our face-to-face meetings. So kind of verification, it can be prospective, which is where you're looking at data in advance of actually doing much. And at that point, you can have, you can work on ideas about what systems, components, and processes you need, and come up with a very nice, clean kind of implementation. But initially in the FAIRplus project, what we did was we did some retrospective verification, which is looking at data sets that had already been generated, and that's more like this, is more like a crash site. And this is a metaphor generated by Philippe. So just to finish up, I've got some links here, and so here's the cookbook link that you can go and browse. There's the webinar that I already talked about. The Fair Wizard, which is something in progress, which is another way to browse or search for recipes in the cookbook. That's in progress. We're expecting that around Q1 next year. There's some documentation papers that will be useful. There's work package 1, cost benefit analysis for verification, and that's very close to submission now. We've got a paper coming in January next year about the verification process itself. So that's about you know, that big exploded diagram I showed you, that kind of work. There's the way the squads work. So that's being written up at the moment. Related tools, there's a data stewardship wizard that you can have a look at. Pistoia Alliance, which is, Pistoia is a pre-competitive pharmaceutical collaboration, and they have their own toolkit around verifying data, which is a different kind of level of detail to what's in the cookbook. Manaz is going to talk to you briefly about the RDM kit next. The fair assessment tools I mentioned, there's lots of them working at different levels of granularity. There's a listing of them here on Fair Assist, and RDA Fair Maturity Working Group. The materials and background for those indicators are linked there. So that's, I just want to acknowledge Tony and Philippe mostly for the slides that I've snaffled for this presentation, and of course the squads that have done all the work. And that's my contact details, and I'll hand over to Manaza.